And it's easy for us type A people to kind of overpower our bodies with just our brain and say, well, I can do this because they have the strength of will that you need to be able to run 30 miles and more. So those folks have to be especially careful to listen to their bodies, I think, and not listen to their brain so much about, hey, let's get back to training because there's another race 6 weeks from now or something. I would caution most people, like if you're performing poorly, especially if you have this acute drop in your performance, it's not that you're not fit enough. It's that you're not rested enough.
Welcome to the TrainingPeaks CoachCast. I'm your host, Dirk Friel. In each episode, we'll sit down with industry experts to discuss coaching methodologies, the latest research, and leading tools for endurance training. Visit TrainingPeaks.com for more training and coaching resources. My next guest is Coach Scott Johnston, who is the co-author of Training for the New Alpinism and Training for the Uphill Athlete. Scott is also the founder of Evoke Endurance Coaching, which works with all types of endurance athletes, including runners, skiers, ultramarathoners, special forces, and many other sports. I hope you enjoy today's discussion where we chat about how to address recovery following ultramarathons. Welcome to the CoachCast, Scott Johnston.
Hey, thanks, Dirk. Thanks for having me on. It's good to see you. It's been a while since we've spoken.
Yeah, well, we kind of speak every day. Full disclosure, you've been my coach and consultant on my training off and on for 4 or 5 years. So I really, really appreciate that and look forward to the comments after my workouts. It's, it gives me extra motivation. So anyways, yeah, so we kind of chat through text daily, which is super nice. Today's topic is about recovering from ultras. And this is going to have a perspective of performance on it. So this isn't how many ultras you can do in how many days or how quickly can we get back to our normal training. It's about how can we perform at our peak, several times a year, and we'll get into that. How many times might we peak? But what does a sound, proper recovery strategy look like from your experience? And before we do that, I'd love to have the audience listen and hear about your background, your coaching experience within ultras, books you've written, et cetera. So kind of give us a lay of the land in terms of your vast experience.
Sure. Well, thanks, Dirk. It's a nice introduction. I'd have to say I don't have vast experience, but I have been coaching endurance athletes for, 35 years or so at different sports. My primary professional coaching career was with World Cup cross-country skiers. And I spent a number of years coaching athletes that were competing on the World Cup and the Olympics, World Championships, that sort of thing. So I had quite a bit of exposure there to the highest levels of performance in that sport. And my own athletic background is more modest probably. I did compete swimming as a kid, and I swam at a Division I school in your hometown there in Boulder, Colorado, on a scholarship. And then I got very interested in climbing when I was, up through high school, and then actually in college, it began to actually impact my swimming career, doing too much climbing. And then I got involved in cross-country skiing while I was at the University of Colorado as well. I hooked up with a few of these Norwegian guys that were living and training there. So I've had a pretty broad background of these different types of endurance sports. And it was during that, while I was competing at what's a moderately high level, I got really interested in what we would be doing for training and why we were doing it and what was understood and the science behind it. And I began a kind of a layperson's deep dive into the physiology and that sort of thing. I got really interested in it. And later, I had a very short and not particularly successful career skiing on the World Cup myself. But after that, I got invited to coach a junior team of skiers. And had some great success with that, a number of national champions and several that went on to the Olympics. But it was there that I began to, as a coach, I finally had the opportunity to put some of these ideas into practice of my things I had learned, stuff that I'd tried on myself, and it proved to be quite successful. Then later, I started working with this fellow, Steve House, who I ended up co-writing a couple of books with. Steve was, he's retired now, right?
Yeah.
Steve's retired from the alpine climbing world now, but at the time he was considered to be the best or one of the best alpinists in the world. And I was coaching him through the kind of most of his professional career. And when partway through that, he had a terrible accident that almost killed him. It ended his climbing career, really his professional climbing career. And he suggested we write a book about what we had done for his training, because people might be interested in. I sort of poo-pooed the idea, thinking, well, no one's actually going to care about this. You could have counted at that time, you could have counted the number of serious alpine climbers that actually trained on one hand, and maybe even had a couple fingers left over.
That first book was Training for the New Alpinism.
Exactly, Training for the New Alpinism, which, and I need to say this, Dirk, I think it's really important. You saw that book. You came to a book tour that we did in Boulder. You said, "Hey, I want to talk to you guys. Can you come out to my office?" And I think it was the next day we drove out to Gun Barrel, where you are or were at that time, and you sat us down and you said, "I think you guys are going to open up a whole new category of training for these mountaineers and mountain sports." And I sort of poo-pooed the idea, thought, wow, that's far-fetched. I just can't imagine people being that interested. Well, you were 100% right, hit the nail right on the head. And
you already had the demand.
Well, we didn't know the demand was there, though. Yeah.
Right.
So shortly after that, at your prompting, your suggestion, we started a business for coaching, and sure enough, it exploded and became quite popular. And then the second book, Training for the Uphill Athlete, which is a little more pertinent to our discussion today, came about because the famous mountain runner and skier and does everything in the mountains, Kilian Jornet, just happened to pick up a copy of the first book, Training for the New Alpinism. And he said, "Hey, I really like what you guys have done here, but it would be great if there was a book like this that was more directed towards, mountain runners and skiers, that sort of thing." And I said, "Well, I'd be interested in writing that if you would help me with it, co-write it." And so he agreed, and he and I spent the winter working on that book. It was fortuitous for me because he had a tib-fib fracture in one of the first skimo races that year and was laid up for many weeks on the couch. Otherwise, you'd never get that guy sitting
that
still.
was me last winter. Broke
That's
my
right.
fibula skiing, skimo racing, so I know the pain.
It's a dangerous sport for sure. But anyway, that allowed him to have the time, or me to get him cornered for long enough till we could put that book together. And that book likewise has had a similar effect on kind of the mountain running and ski mountaineering community.
And that title is Training for the Uphill Athlete.
Training for the Uphill Athlete, yes. And so these books were both trying to combine the theory of training that we learn and that I had learned over almost a lifetime of endurance sport, training for endurance sports, using the conventional sports as a model. Sports like running, cross-country skiing, cycling, rowing, swimming, all of those things. There's a very robust body of knowledge that's pretty well understood in those sports. But the people who have been attracted to these unconventional sports, like alpinism or mountaineering or mountain running, often don't have that background or that exposure. So I was trying to kind of condense this information I had learned in the conventional sports and make it applicable to the mountain sports. So that's, for anybody who's wondering what goes on in these books, that's essentially it.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you also think about those other sports, cycling, swimming, track running. They tend to have more controls involved. The actual course is more controlled, or the swim lane is always the same, or in cycling, you have a power meter. So it's a little more ethereal, some of these concepts. So you have to like discuss how do you track load, et cetera, within an ultra, right? And then that leads us to, okay, the concept of recovery. And so I'd love to like, first we need to frame recovery. Recovery is a spectrum. There's a recovery of like every Monday I have a recovery run, and I have a hard Sunday run and a recovery run Monday, and I hit it hard Tuesday. Like that's part of recovery, right? That's a form of recovery and a certain amount of recovery. But today's discussion is around recovery post race, specifically from an ultra that's 50K or more, right? So how do you define recovery from a race, and what does that kind of spectrum look like? What is your ultimate kind of, I guess, case study of what you would like to see versus what sometimes how do you alter it? So anyways, that's a big question, but how do we frame recovery after an ultra?
Well, yeah, it is a big question, and I think what we have to agree upon our language here. First of all, that we're going to be speaking in generalities. I mean, every athlete is an individual and
Yes.
has different responses. Some people are naturally gifted with the ability to recover very quickly from hard efforts. Others are going to take more time. So I think what I'd like to do is sort of, first of all, state that we're not saying this recipe that we might be talking about isn't directly applicable to every single person, but it can serve
Right.
as some guidelines, I think, for people.
Yep.
And having those guidelines, you can think about how you can apply them to yourself. So obviously running 30 miles or more at a time, especially in a hard race, is incredibly taxing, primarily on the nervous system. The endurance sports, the biggest fatigue load comes from central nervous system fatigue because of the repetitive nature, just putting one foot in front of the other. And that central nervous system fatigue, there's obviously other types of fatigue that go along with it. There's the metabolic fatigue from, carbohydrate or let's say caloric deficit that you might be running under for many hours at a time. Those things are generally recovered from fairly quickly, the caloric issue. But the central nervous system fatigue, I think, is something both in training on a daily basis, but also, especially in racing, people don't, because we don't have a great way of measuring it. I mean, we can talk a little bit about heart rate variability because that's the typical way we can look at the central nervous system, and it has its pros and cons. And, I've had a lot of experience with it. I've worked with heart rate variability for almost 20 years and seen good and bad. And I don't think I wish it was a panacea. I don't think it is. But anyway, so I think we have to be concerned about this central nervous system fatigue issue. And that's where, in a post-race, just like you've done this as a professional cyclist, how you would try to remember, I know it's a while ago. Remember when you did a big training block, like a training camp or something like that, you would feel, even though the training camp, had been quite tiring and, almost exhausting, often a couple of days after, you're still feeling really quite good. And there's this hormonal rush that comes from having your nervous system, like your sympathetic nervous system, jacked up for a week of training. But then about Wednesday, the other shoe drops, and all of a sudden you go, oh my gosh, I'm really tired. And that can happen during training, but also after races. I've had people who do races and then they think they're ready to start training again because they are feeling good, a couple of days after the race, or they are excited to start training again because they realize, oh, I should have done this, or I could have changed my training in this way or that way. And racing can be a big motivator. And so I think for one of the caveats I like to put out there when I'm talking to any endurance athlete, but I think anybody who's attracted to running for, many hours at a time, is going to be kind of a type A personality. It's hard. You can't deny that. I mean, we are all that way if we're involved in endurance sports. And it's easy for us type A people to kind of overpower our bodies with just our brain and say, well, I can do this. And I mean, I'm sure you've run into this yourself. I see it all the time where, if I write a training program for somebody or I'm coaching them and it says on Tuesday they're doing this workout. Well, what if on Tuesday they wake up and they feel terrible? Well, many type A's will still go do that workout because they have the strength of will that you need to be able to run 30 miles and more. So those folks have to be especially careful to listen to their bodies, I think, and not listen to their brain so much about, hey, let's get back to training because there's another race 6 weeks from now or something.
Yeah. Okay, so then what would you like to see before you get back into normal training? What kind of signs are you looking for in terms of like recovery measures before you will say, okay, I think this athlete's ready for a normal training block starting now? What does that kind of look like?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that we'll assess is soreness, muscle damage, which in these mountain running sports, that's a huge issue because of the downhill running, the eccentric loading that comes along with all that.
Yeah, the muscle damage.
But luckily, that usually goes away within a few days and people are able to walk normally and all that. So that's kind of the first big red flag that you need to be aware of. Then often kind of their motivation and their mood. If they're feeling, the athletes I work with are often quite high level, and so they have a pretty good feel and a sense of their emotional state day to day. And, if they tell me, hey, I don't feel like training today, then that's a giant red flag that tells me, okay, there's something going on. This is a person that loves to train. We have to be, careful about that. I do think that if you have a history of using heart rate variability, it can be a pretty good indicator. I mean, I wouldn't use it as the sole marker of recovery, but right. It is. You couldn't use it if you started a week before the race. It won't be valid. But if you have a year's worth of heart rate variability data, then you can see what your normal heart rate variability scores are. That can be helpful because obviously the heart rate variability will be quite depressed after an extended hard effort like this. And it may stay depressed for weeks or for days. And potentially, if it's hard enough, it might be a few weeks that it should before you're feeling fully back to ready to go. So I think that those are some of the targets I look at. And then generally, I like to, like after 100K, even for, if it's a race where people are pushing themselves, I often think 2 weeks is going to be about the right amount of time for people to get back to serious training. And for a 100-mile race, it could be easily a month before they're really ready to absorb a high level of training like they were doing leading into the race.
Right. And then there's kind of the joke that every single ultra runner finishes the race with an injury. There's some amount of truth to that in terms of like there's soreness, right? There's a little bit of a knee twinge or knee pain. Is that soreness or is that an injury? So, like there's these acute little things that are happening that, do you ever have to like worry about that little acute twinge becoming an injury if you start too early? And helping navigate that with the athlete and really trying to dig in and make sure some of these soreness issues, these tweaks don't become an injury if they start too early.
Yes, I am hypersensitive to injury and illness signals from the athletes I work with, because I think that's an indication that you've stressed your body more than it's capable of handling at this point. And we need to listen to those kind of things. I'm sure people do it, but I never want people to try to train with an injury. Maybe we would switch from running to swimming or cycling if there's a lower leg injury or something. But I wouldn't just tell them, "Oh, don't worry about it. It'll go away," because I've seen too many. Yes, and it might happen. That might be the case. Just like if you, well, it's only a cold, so I'll just train through this cold. Well, yes,
Right.
and you might be fine, but it could also turn into bronchitis and cost us 3 weeks of training.
Right.
And to me, it's just not worth the risk reward ratio just isn't there. And so I feel like it's way better to err on the conservative side. And yes, maybe we have a few light days of training or maybe even a week of lost time of training time, but we can regain that fitness very quickly with a fit athlete. That's one of the things I think people don't realize. And you and I have exchanged a couple little messages about this. People, your fitness doesn't go away overnight. And often we are confused by a lack of performance that we think is resulting from not enough fitness, but what it's the lack of performance is coming from too much fatigue.
Yeah.
And so we often, I think, are too eager to hurry back to training because we're afraid that we're going to lose fitness too fast. Well,
Right.
and granted, taking a month off after a 100-miler, you're going to lose fitness. There's no question about it. But if we start back too soon and maybe we get 10 days into a training period and all of a sudden it becomes really obvious that you're exhausted from the race still, or you just don't have the legs to handle it, then now we're starting from zero over again. So for me, again, that's sort of my conservative mindset of just let's be more cautious. Let's get you started back because it might take 2 or 3 weeks before you feel like you're back to your normal self, but it will come back and it will come back just fine. I mean, I don't have a problem with people missing training, if for obviously a legitimate reason like illness or
Yeah.
injury or a race or something, because
Yeah.
no, we can get them back to fitness.
How about factors that affect recovery? I mean, let's just start with age,
Yeah.
or experience level. What, how might that vary from what you've seen?
Well, I think there's no question that age is probably the biggest. Once over the age of 40, age probably becomes the biggest factor in terms of the amount of training you can handle on a daily basis, because your recovery on a daily basis is going to be impacted, and certainly the time it takes to recover from a race will be longer. The only advantage you might have as you age and you slow down is that the impact loading that running imparts on our legs isn't as high because you're not running as fast as you did when you're
Yeah.
50. You're not running as fast as you did when you're 25. So age, I think, is a factor that we can't deny, and it does have a big effect. But once again, there's a lot of personal variability there. Experience obviously has a huge part to play in it. Athletes that are professionals that have been doing this for years are going to have a much better handle on how long it takes them to recover, but also what they need to do during that recovery period. I'm an advocate for active recovery. In other words, recovery doesn't mean just sitting on the couch doing nothing. Active recovery means whether, like for my runners, I think often go for a swim. There's nothing that will, anybody who's a triathlete will tell you this, that there's nothing that will make your legs feel better after a hard run than to go for a swim. It's as good as a massage. So I think that having a few tools, there's a lot of different kinds of recovery tools. One of the athletes I coach, Tom Evans, when I ask him, "What do you think the most important recovery tool is for ultra runner?" He said, "A good mattress." And
Yeah.
it's very simple, but I think it's really true. Sleep is the number one recovery tool that we all have access to, and getting good quality sleep, I think, is important. Obviously, after Tom also told me when I was asking about this, he said, "I eat the cleanest diet in the few days after a race." Because that's when I'm probably the most concerned with what I eat, is after the race. So that, because my body is obviously, there's a temptation to just gorge on whatever because you're so calorie deprived for so long. But anyway, for him, that's an important thing to do.
Do you
Pay
give
attention
advice
to your
to
diet.
your athletes about nutrition specifically, things to consider post race?
No, to be totally honest, I don't. And that's because I have seen and it's kind of crazy. Nutrition, I think, is one of those subjects that can be extremely confusing, and there's so much conflicting information. But if we look at someone like Zach Bitter, who holds the 100-mile record for the U.S., he spends a lot of time on a carnivore diet. And at the other end of the dietary spectrum, we have the kind of the grand old man of American ultra running, Scott Jurek, who's a vegan. So both of these guys with these, polar opposite diets have achieved very good success. Yeah. So I think you have to decide what works for you. And I think that's an important quality. And I don't like to give kind of categorical recommendations. I mean, obviously, you don't want to be eating a box of Oreos every day or something like that.
Right. And you brought up Tom Evans, but you also coach Ruth Croft, that was second at UTMB recently.
That's correct. Yeah.
And I'd love to have you share, what her recovery looked like, if you can. And I mean, you've mentioned to me, a 1 month recovery. There was a 10-day meditation retreat. We'd love to hear some of the details of how her recovery has gone since UTMB. And as of recording, this was 7 weeks ago, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And she's actually just now in her second week of training back.
Okay.
And we can talk a little bit about that and how it's going for her. But yes, so this was her A race for the year. She'd had a number of other, she didn't lose a single race this year other than being second at UTMB. So coming into this, she was coming off of a pretty solid winning streak, but all those races had been building, and there weren't that many, 4 races, building up to UTMB that were all kind of B races for her. So this was the big one. And so psychologically, it was tough. Running 100 and some miles with 30,000 vertical feet of elevation gain and loss is a big deal for anybody. But so for her, psychologically, after that race, it was like, I need a break. I need to step away from, being tied to a schedule and doing nothing but eating, sleeping, and training. And so we chatted, of course, after the race several times, and she said, I just need to take a break and not do anything because I don't feel like training at all right now.
That motivation and psychology side of things, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a huge component. When you have somebody who's that hard charging kind of personality and they tell you they want a break, then you definitely want to pay attention to that. And then toward the end of that month, she went on a 10-day meditation retreat where, this sounds almost as hard as an ultra run. They were meditating 10 hours a day and on a restricted diet. So she lost a bit of weight on that. Wow. So we've just gotten her back to training now. And coming back from a 5-week break, it's going to take her a few weeks to get back to feeling like an athlete again. She's complaining of feeling kind of stiff and crotchety and all that, but I know that'll go away. We've been through this before with her. I think that's something that someone like her who's had a long career of this. She ran through college and now has an ultra runner for quite a few years, and she's right up there with the best. I think that when you see that a person like that, who's obviously talented, has a huge training history, and has been at this a long time, realize I have to let my body recover if I'm going to stay in this sport a long time. This is not like going to your local city park and running a 10K or a 5K on the weekend where, 2 days later, I'm going to be bounced back and ready to go again. And I think a lot of people just don't recognize the stress that this puts on the body. And the ultra running world, that's one of the things that has surprised me. I've been coaching in the ultra running space for about 10 years. It's been really surprising to me to see the kind of collateral damage, the bodies that are littering the side of the trail over the years of people who showed huge promise, lots of talent, and then something happened and they just dropped off the radar. And I think in many cases it's that overdid it and did too much too soon without enough recovery. I love that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I love that thought of rest equals longevity, like extending your career via rest. Anybody can go out and train really hard every single day, but the rest component is what almost takes the most courage, to know that it will have long-term benefits down the road. And I feel like Ruth had a true peak. I mean, she was second, maybe she can go faster, but she was running Kate down. I think you mentioned on the final downhill, I don't know how many more minutes faster she was than Kate, but she was able to really run down first place. She didn't catch her, but she was making time, meaning she had an amazing race strategy and peak, but then along with that is so much, I guess, built up stress internally of your entire life for months on end is focused around that you just need to like let it go. And then by letting go, that hopefully will extend her career to have an even better peak next year. So that confidence level is what is tough for people to swallow the ego, to say, yeah, I'm fine. I'm going to go do another 20 miler a week after UTMB. Like, I know you can do that as an athlete, but what are your long-term goals? If you don't have long-term goals, okay, that's fine. But if you want to do something, and have another strong peak, it's that courage to take time off, and that psychological side has a big impact.
Well, because ego is a big driver in any of these
Yeah.
kind of competitive activities like this. Ego is really part of what pushes us to do what we do, and so we have to. It can become the ego can be a terrible slave driver. And I think that just harking back for a moment to my work with the World Cup cross country skiers, they would race about 40 times in a season, and there's almost no breaks. Starting in late November through March, by the end of that season, their bank account is pretty much empty. Even if they've had a great season and they finish strong, everybody's just getting worn down. And typically, I would insist that people take at least a month and go do some recreational thing. I don't care if it's golf or rock climbing or kayaking or badminton. It doesn't matter. You need to do some of the things you really enjoy doing that you can't do when you're in a serious training program. And then they're fresh and ready. And so usually by sometime in May, we could start training again. But I just learned over the years that you had to have that break, that just to kind of recharge your batteries. And I think it's even more important in a sport like this that is so, again, that central nervous system fatigue. You just get worn down. And many of us, this is a problem with, I think, all endurance athletes, but in this sport is all about being tired. You're going to be tired in training. You're going to be tired in racing. So you kind of recalibrate your brain as to what an acceptable level of fatigue is. And I think people forget what it's like to feel fresh and to feel good. And you're right. Ruth did have a really good peak for that race. Just to set the statistics correct, on the last big climb of that race, Ruth put 13 minutes into Katie. Regained back 13 minutes. And then on the final descent that you were just mentioning into town, Ruth was 4 minutes faster than the winning man on that final downhill.
Really?
It's only 5 kilometers.
I know. Wow. I actually ran it. I took the Flégère tram up and then watched some of the racers, and I ran down it. So got to experience it. But wow, that is some amazing stats. That's good job, coach.
Well, it was fun. She's a great athlete to work with. She's really fun and very, as serious as she is, she's got a great perspective on this, and she's pretty mellow person to work with. And maybe that comes from that meditation that she does.
I think education, you have to educate the athlete in terms of the reason we're doing this and to build that confidence in them to take that time off, and that education builds over time. And the opposite's true. Like coming into the race, they have to learn to rest, right? They have to get rid of this fatigue in order to perform at their peak. And that's, again, a very hard, we've been talking about this for 30 minutes, but going into the race is the same thing. A lot of athletes overdo it going into the race as well as overdo it after the race. So let's not be vanilla. Let's not just run the same pace all the time, but let's have these peaks and valleys. And to create the peaks and valleys, you have to truly understand rest and where to put it in and for how long.
100% agree with that. It's interesting. Tom was third at UTMB in 2022, and then shortly after that got married and went on an extended honeymoon for like 2 months. We didn't even start training again until middle of December. And I think that's another one of those cases where he recognized I need a break, and he had a good excuse for the break, getting married. But what you just said about people not resting enough going into the race, I think that's actually a bigger problem than people getting started again too soon. Because I think that a lot of us have, because again, that ego thing and the being type A, where enough is never enough. We always think a little more will be better. And typically in endurance sports, more is better, but it's better up to a point. And then at that point, the wheels come off and it's suddenly a disaster.
Or your timeline is too short.
Yes. Well, and I think what I see is that people get close to the race and they think, oh, I haven't done enough of this or that. I better add a few of these special workouts here in the last 10 days. And they get greedy with their training. And if you've done your work in the months leading into this race, then the money is already in the bank. And one of my favorite quotes by the famous running coach Renato Canova is that he said this about some of his champion athletes. He said leading in the final two weeks leading into the World Championships, there's very little we can do to make the athlete faster, but there's a lot we can do to make the athlete slower. And I think that's so important for people to realize. It's like, if you're fit and you're ready to go, it's way better to stand on the starting line a little bit over rested and maybe slightly undertrained than it is to be even the tiny bit overtrained from having tried to get greedy in those final couple of weeks.
Definite. I've got another athlete story here. I reached out to Heather Jackson about her thoughts. She did not do UTMB. She did CCC, which is 100 kilometers, correct?
Correct.
It's the last 100 kilometers of UTMB. Next year, she plans to do the full UTMB. She was fifth in CCC this year. And she said recovery from CCC took a bit longer than I would have liked or expected, but it's hard to decipher what was recovery from the race versus sickness I got from flying back. So that's another point in terms of your immune system being compromised. You are now at a higher susceptibility of getting sick. Hence, Heather got sick, she assumes, from traveling back from France. And so that added to her time. So that's another thing to keep in mind is give yourself some more recovery, and hopefully stay healthy.
Well, and it might be that came at the perfect time. Rather than getting sick the week after the race is a lot better than getting sick the week before the race because you overdid it. Because now she's sort of forced into a resting state when she's sick. And so if it's ever fortuitous to be sick, which it isn't, that might be, it's a little lesser of two evils there.
Yeah. She goes on to say, it took me about 3 weeks to come around from that combo whammy on the body, when usually it takes me about 2 weeks before I start to feel somewhat normal from the long distance trail races. I mostly focus on sleep, eating a lot, massage, and lots of Epsom salt baths. And just listening to how I feel. Usually about a week of not much, and then a week of just 30 to 60 minute jogs and bike spins, sometimes even another week before I do an actual effort. I think the bike helps a lot with recovery. And what's interesting with her is her next race was a bike race. She's a dual athlete. She's paid to race gravel races as well as ultras. And so she did what's called the Big Sugar, which was about a month after UTMB. So she incorporates a lot of cycling year round. And you mentioned that earlier, swimming, cycling, are these moments in time
Yeah.
where you kind of mix things up and add some of these cross training?
I actually use cycling a fair bit with the elite runners I work with.
Hmm.
Or no, I mean, I shouldn't say I use it. They use it. Um, I think it's a great way to add volume without the pounding. And when you're already training, someone like Tom, 120 miles a week, you can't just keep piling more running miles on that.
Yeah.
So we add a fair bit. He loves to ride, so we add a fair bit of cycling into his trainings. Ruth does less cycling, but some. And I think it is a good way to add volume for them. That it isn't as applicable perhaps as would be to run, but we can't get them running anymore. They're already kind of at their running limit. Whereas with somebody who's just getting started in these sports, you really do. I mean, if you're just getting started and you don't have a running history, then being on the bike will also help you. But by the same token, you need to get your legs ready to run a long distance, and the only way you can
Yeah.
do that is to accumulate a lot of miles in your legs. And so for them, I don't encourage cycling as much, except as a recovery activity
Hmm.
for for most people, recreational and amateurs.
No, it's a great time to have that, post race. As you mentioned,
Yeah.
swimming is maybe another great one. So, yeah, any kind of closing thoughts here, Scott? Anything we missed you want to hit on? Advice for folks that are listening, planning on their next ultra?
I guess I think that the most important thing to take away is that these things we've talked about today are once again kind of general discussion areas. They're not meant
Hmm.
to prescribe something to each individual that's out there, because I think you're going to figure this out on your own. But I would caution most people, like if you're performing poorly, especially if you have this acute drop in your performance, it's not that you're not fit enough. It's that you're not rested enough. So if even on a daily basis with your training, let's say you are, handling a certain type of training load, and all of a sudden you notice something, you just don't feel as good when you're running. It's not because your fitness went away overnight. It just doesn't happen that way. There's something else. Either maybe you're getting sick, maybe there's other stressors in your life, but for whatever reason, this stress, fatigue, illness thing is masking your fitness. And I believe it's really important for people to pay attention to that. Like it doesn't, obviously you have a business and own a company that specializes in helping people monitor their recovery state. I use those tools every day with athletes I work with. But even if you're just keeping a training log in a spiral notebook, what I like to have, what I used to do with the kids when I first started coaching cross country skiing was after each day of training, I would ask them to give themselves a grade on that workout,
Yeah.
all the way from an A to an F. And then what I would
Mm.
tell them is that if you see more than 3 C's in a week, you need to let me know. We're going to
Right.
give you an easy day, or just something as simple as that can be really helpful. And I think the same can be true. And we're taking this back to recovery. Is if you get out of bed in the morning and you are hobbling, and it's even if it's 10 days after the race, and you're hobbling to the bathroom, like you're not ready to train.
Yeah.
Forget it. You need a break still. And I think
Yeah.
too many people are willing to override that warning sign and jump back into it.
I think being honest with yourself, putting that ego aside again, and the subject, it's such a great way to end this, is the subjective feedback is more important than the objective, or you think internal stress versus your statistics. Like the goal this week is not
Mhm.
to run 50 miles, it's to monitor my internal subjective feel and my internal stress. And that internal stress needs to be restorative, not
Yeah.
to build fitness, but to be restorative. So that's, yeah, absolutely agree. The subjective, the diary, the mood, all that, um, getting that recorded down on paper or in TrainingPeaks is definitely a great way. And I love that concept of A to F. And if you have 3 C's in a week, and definitely, that was me last week.
Right.
You know?
Right. But you've incorporated this. I don't know when you did put the little smiley face thing
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the number that people can
Or a
grade their
frown.
workouts that way. That's the same idea. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I insist on with my athletes is every real training session, not just if they go out and do an easy run or something, but whenever there's a real workout, I insist on comments. I need to know, how did your legs feel? How did this workout go for you? I can see in TrainingPeaks the heart rate, the pace, the elevation, all of those things, but I want to know what you felt like the impact of that was subjectively.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the secret sauce right there.
Yeah, it is. It works. It's worked
Yeah.
great. I think the combination of the objective and subjective is important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks a lot. How can people find you? It's Evoke Endurance, right?
Yep, Scott at Evoke Endurance, and you can go to our website, evokeendurance.com, where we've got a ton of free information. Don't have paywalls or anything like that. We try to get people to understand, training and educate them on, like, this is how athletes, in other sports train. So you should consider, utilizing those kind of methodologies. And so we've tried to translate, again, those conventional sport methodologies into these unconventional sports and educate people about that.
Perfect. Thanks for your time. That was great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for the conversation.
Well, thanks for having me, Dirk. It's good to actually see your face.
Thanks for listening to the Training Peaks CoachCast. Visit trainingpeaks.com for more training and coaching resources.